Tonight we are going to continue our lesson in the Making Firm the Foundation series of first principle classes, and that being lesson number 4, from Adam to Abraham. Now, this particular section is historical, because we've already considered the theme, the central theme of the Bible. We've considered the timetable of the 7,000 years. And so now we're getting into, from Genesis, actually this entire series actually starts in Genesis, and it looks like we've got pretty much of a full slide tonight, whereas last week we were getting only half a slide due to the projector. But as you can read on the slide and in the notes that I handed you, the lesson is divided into 3 sections, and it takes us from Genesis chapter 4 through chapter 11. In the period covered by these chapters, we find some of the most dramatic events in the history of mankind. In the first reference, we see, through the children of Adam and Eve, a conflict that existed between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman, and that would continue throughout all history. You'll recall in our previous lessons, lesson 3, that we saw how Adam and Eve were created, how they were placed in a garden of God, and how that sin entered into the world through the voice of the serpent. And in this particular lesson, we're going to see that verses 3 through 5 reveal the actual occupations of Cain and Abel. It is evident from Hebrews 11:4 that they had been instructed in the significance and procedure relative to the offering of sacrifice, which of course we recall from Genesis 3 was established after Adam and Eve had sinned, and God covered their nakedness with the skins of beasts, and instead of their own contrivance, which was coverings of fig leaves. So God stripped them of those and covered them with the skins of a slain beast, and that established a protocol, or a ritual, if you would, for sacrifice to cover the nakedness of Adam and Eve and cover their sins, because man left to himself and his own devices ends up without any kind of a covering. So we read in this reference that it was by faith that Abel offered a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, and faith implies understanding and belief, which is what evidently Abel did have and Cain did not have. He had knowledge and he had understanding, but he didn't believe it to the point of motivation and action. In verses 6 through 7, Cain had an equal opportunity to do what was pleasing in God's sight, but it appears he chose to violate those principles of sacrifice and put his own will before that of the Creator. When God refused Cain's sacrifice, Cain gave vent to his rebellious attitude by killing Abel, his brother. And in verse 8, a pattern is set which finds its focal point in the type at the cross of Christ. The continuation of the seed of the woman is shown in verse 25, because God had appointed Eve another seed, and that of course was Seth, to continue her seed instead of Abel. She shows her understanding of this by choosing for her son the name of Seth, meaning appointed. Now on the slide you'll notice that we have a chronology here illustrated by these characters from Adam all the way to Abram. And in Genesis chapters 1 through 5, and then chapters 6 through 9, and Genesis chapter 10 through 12. And you can actually see that many of these men were contemporary with each other. Now, whether they lived in the same geographical location or not, we don't know. We do know that at one time they did, because God had to expel them from the Tower of Babel and building a city and a tower and trying to do things their own way after God had told them to go forth and replenish the earth, and they refused. So they challenged God's directive. But you'll notice on this particular chart that Adam lived to be 930 years, which was a considerably long time. He was still, of course, flesh and blood. He was still, but he was being the original forefather of the species, he and Eve. It stands to reason that sin had not yet taken its full toll, but eventually the record tells us that he did die, as it did for all of them, except with one exception. That would be Enoch. And you'll notice in the orange, he lived 365 years, and but God took him, and actually that he should not see death, and he didn't. He was taken. But he was taken in his physical being, so it's not like he was changed to become spirit. He was taken away from the current evil. Then you see the Methuselah, and he is the oldest man. We've even heard statements by people saying he's as old as Methuselah. And so he lived to be 969 years, and then Lamech, and then Noah, who was the builder of the ark. And so Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And he goes all the way down to the very last man at the bottom there, who was Abram. He lived to be 175 years old. Back in Genesis chapter 4, if we put in verse 1 and 2, we read that Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bare Cain, and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. And she again bare his brother Abel, and Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. Now, in this record, we're going to see that there are 2 communities that are developing, and they are going to develop from these 2 men, Cain and Abel, the first brothers, the first children of Adam and Eve. We read in chapter 4, verse 3 through 5, and in process of time it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord. And Abel, he also brought of the firstlings of his flock, and of the fat thereof. And the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering, but unto Cain and to his offering he had not respect. And Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell. Verses 3 through 5 reveal the occupations of Cain and Abel. As we read earlier in Hebrews 11:4, they had been instructed in the significance and the procedure relative to sacrifice. We read in this reference that it was by faith that Abel offered a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain. And faith actually implies understanding and belief. So as we mentioned earlier, it was chapter 3 of Genesis where God killed the beast, stripped Adam and Eve of their fig leaf coverings, and showed them, taught them, explained to them the necessary procedures to be acceptable before God. And otherwise, if they refused, like Cain refused to acknowledge these principles, their worship was unacceptable to God. In Genesis 4, 6 through 7, we read, And the Lord said unto Cain, Why art thou wroth? And why is thy countenance fallen? If thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted? And if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door, and unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. Now, a lot of times people will interpret this verse as though God is talking to Cain and telling him that sin is lying at the door and waiting for you, and sin is going to consume you, as in, unto thee shall be his desire, but thou shalt rule over him. But there's some implication in this verse that we need to be aware of from our previous lessons. And that implication is that the Lord was speaking to Cain with a certain understanding that Cain was the firstborn of the 2 brothers. Abel being the younger brother. And so when the Lord was talking to Cain, he was actually trying to explain to him, you know the protocol and procedures of worship. You know that worship, and you know that if you do well, you'll be accepted, but if you don't, you will not be accepted. Okay, so this explanation, or this dialogue between the Lord and Cain, the Lord is really trying to tell him that if you do not well, sin lieth at the door. We're questioning, well, what does that mean? And the following sentence, and unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. Well, it's important for us to recognize that the word sin, and we'll look at it in the next slide, but in this particular slide you'll notice, if thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted or favored. And if thou doest not well, sin, an offering is really how this word should be rendered. An acceptable sacrifice lieth at the door, or is readily accessible or available from your brother Abel, because remember, Abel was a keeper of sheep, and that was the proper sacrifice. It was a clean animal, goats, sheep, cattle, and Abel was a keeper of sheep, Cain was a tiller of the ground. And unto thee shall be his desire. Well, it's not sin's desire, it's Abel's desire. Well, why would Abel desire Cain, his brother, and why would Cain have rule over him? And it's simply because before the law of Moses was given to Israel through Moses, after the Exodus, and the children of Israel were at the foot of Mount Horeb, and God gave the 10 Commandments on stone, and he gave the Book of the Covenant, and he gave the rituals and procedures of the law. The priest was actually considered to be the father of the household. He was the priest. He had the status of offering like Job did, Abraham did, Noah did. It goes all the way back to Adam. So Adam would have been the priest, but his firstborn son would have been the next in line to inherit the priestly possessions, the priestly status, the priestly favor between man and God, or between the family and God in this case. So we have to remember that there was a lot of background to this conversation, that Cain was actually in line to be the next priest of the family. But because God had rejected his sacrifice, and the reason being it had no bloodletting, there was no loss of life and shedding of blood, and that's the only way sin can be forgiven and covered. So Cain's offering of fruits and vegetables would have been accepted by God, readily accepted, had he acknowledged the important foundational principle of the shedding of blood and loss of life, and brought an offering of a lamb. And where was he to get the lamb? Well, he was to get the lamb from his younger brother Abel, which meant that he would have to lower his pride. And Cain had a lot of pride and a lot of arrogance, just like the Jews did when Jesus showed up. And here's the son of a carpenter with much, much more biblical education than anyone in the world. And yet here he was, an unschooled, uncultured, uncultivated branch that was running circles around the Pharisees, who were supposed to be the highest, most knowledgeable men in the law in Israel. So their pride and arrogance not only got them angry at Jesus, but they did ultimately just what we're going to find Cain is going to do. He let his anger grow against his brother and his jealousy to the point where he kills him. But it's important for us to understand this, that this is an extension of the battle that God set forth in Genesis 3:15, when he told the serpent, I will put enmity, in the King James Version the word enmity, and it means hatred, I will put hatred between thee and the woman. So he's talking to the serpent, and he's telling the serpent, I'll put hatred between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed, and it shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. That was a declaration of war between the serpent and the serpent's seed, and the woman and her seed. So there were two parties. Now here in chapter 4, we're starting to see the real material manifestation in the flesh between two parties, Cain and Abel. Cain being a descendant of the serpent's thinking, and Abel being a descendant of the thinking of the woman and the seed of the woman. Now, when we talk about types in the Bible, we know that types point forward to greater developments and greater substantial outcome, and that would be Abel would be a type of Jesus. Cain would be a type of the Jews, the kinsmen of Jesus, who grew angry, and they were in the position of the priest, just as Cain was in the position to inherit the priesthood. But Cain let his anger overcome him, even after a one-on-one dialogue with God. And God told him, said, look, you know, if you don't do well, if you do well, you're accepted. If you don't do well, there's a remedy. You just get your sin covered by bringing the right sacrifice, but you can't bring what you want to bring. And today, people who read the Bible and believe in God think that He will accept them because they're sincere. And nothing could be further from the truth. God is not interested, I mean, He's interested in sincerity, but it's got to be sincerity based upon what He says, not upon what they want Him to say or what they believe Him to say without searching the Bible. It's extremely important for us all to submit our ideas, if they're wrong, to the right way. And God gives us the right way in His Word. And that's what we have to study. That's why we have to study, so that we do not sew together fig leaves like Adam and Eve did when they sinned, so that we do not bring fruits and vegetables that require no blood offering or life shedding, but instead we might think like Cain did, this is by the sweat of my brow I have brought all these fruits and vegetables as a good work and a show of gratitude and sincerity to God, and He's refusing it. On what grounds, Lord? Cain might ask, and we might ask. But God says, upon the grounds that you're not believing my word. And my word is what you must believe in order to be accepted by me. That's what God is telling him. So, if we move on, there are some other uses of the word sin in the Bible. And the slide shows us in Leviticus 4 verse 3, if it is the anointed priest who sins, thus bringing guilt on the people, then he shall offer for the sin that he has committed a bull from the herd without blemish to the Lord for a sin offering. Same words for sin in that verse, for the sin that he's committed, a bull without blemish to the Lord for a sin offering. Well, the word sin offering, as you see underlined, and the word sin are the same word. So they're just used as in metonymy, one for the other, a part for the whole, a whole for the part, and it's the same word. In the Authorized Version, or King James Version, that word, well, in the Hebrew, the word is chata'ath, at the Strong's 2403. And the word chata'ah is actually in the King James translated sin 182 times. It's translated sin offering 116 times. It's translated punishment 3 times, purification for sin twice, purifying once, sinful once, and sinner once. So you can see that the most ways it's translated is either sin or sin offering. So when we go back and look at that verse that we just looked at, when it says sin lieth at the door, it makes sense, because God says basically to Cain, if you step outside your door, Cain, there is a lamb laying right there. Yes, it belongs to Abel, but he'll be the first one to offer it to you for an offering. and you can just about be sure he's not going to charge you anything the way that people do today. So we can see that God was trying and giving Cain every opportunity to cover his sins in the proper way. But this is the thing, this is the principle that every single person who comes to God must understand, that just adopting a form of worship because of various reasons that appeal to us is not acceptable. The mind has to be one with the mind of God. And the more we question, well, what is the mind of God? The more he's pleased in that we are seeking the answers from his Word, because his Word truly is the mind of God. And as we go deeper into the Word of God and study it, we'll have more evidence than we can ever imagine. So the evidence is overwhelming that God expects us to lay down our lives. Okay, well, we do that in varying degrees, but it has to be laid down, our life has to be laid down in a prescribed way. And God has already prescribed that way today. He prescribed it back in the days of Cain and Abel, and he gave them the instructions on what to do. He did it in the days of Noah, he did it in the days of Abraham, he did it in the days of Isaac, Jacob, he did it in the days of David. And as he did this, people obeyed by doing what he said because they believed what he said, and they were blessed and favored for it. Today it's no different. We are told through the New Testament and the four Gospels that we must believe in the things concerning the kingdom of God and the things concerning Jesus Christ. And when we understand those things, believe them, we repent from the old way of belief and old way of life that we've been living and are baptized, and then that brings us into favor because we are actually being baptized with Christ. Verse 6 and 7, Cain, we remember, had equal opportunity to do what was pleasing in God's sight, but it appears he chose to violate the principle of sacrifice and put his own will before that of the Creator. So when God refused Cain's sacrifice, Cain gave vent to his rebellious feelings and killed Abel, his brother. We read in verse 8 of Genesis 4 that Cain talked with Abel, his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and slew him. So in this verse, we see a pattern set. It finds its focal point in the type of the cross at the time of Christ. The continuation of the seed of the woman is shown in verse 25, because God had appointed Eve another son to continue her seed, her lineage, instead of Abel. And she shows her understanding of this by choosing for her son the name of Seth, which means appointed.
After this, is Cain spoke of anymore?
He is. In chapter 4, he is spoken of, and we'll see in other places in the New Testament he's spoken of, but not in a very good light. As a matter of fact, it reminds me of the t-shirt that says, "No man is completely useless, he can always serve as a bad example." And that's exactly what Cain ended up, as a bad example. And we'll take a look at some of those here in a moment. He is spoken of, his genealogy is spoken of as the community, because he was separated by God. He was driven out and caused to become a vagabond, and we'll see that here in a moment, that his life was, he was driven away from the seed of the woman, so a huge separation occurred after the murder of Abel. And but God was watching over Cain, because Cain would then become the father of all of those who would leave the premises of God. It's almost like he was causing magnetism, and he'd be separating by, like if you were to have a cup full of sawdust and a cup full of iron filings and you mixed them together, best way to get them separated is with a magnet, and it pulls all the iron filings away if you pass the magnet over the sawdust, and it leaves the sawdust there. the kind of attitude that Cain had was passed on to his children. And those children developed into a community of men and women who collected or attracted those from the Christ community, or the Abel community, the Seth community rather, of Adam and Eve's family, who were worshipers of God because they believed God. They obeyed God. They did what God wanted them to do. So Cain's community, a child might grow up to be old enough to leave off on their own, and we've seen this all through history. And a family might be a godly parentage. They might be raising their children in a godly way, but when a son gets up old enough and takes on a rebellious attitude, he doesn't want to be told what to do. He doesn't want to listen to the authority of God, which is exactly what Cain was all about. He was doing his own thing. He was willing to be religious as long as God accepted his terms. I'm going to be religious on my terms.
He got cocky about it.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did. So, you see this chart, the ages of the patriarchs, all the way to the flood, and then all the way down to Abraham, and or to even further, actually.
Are all their ages spelled out in the sea? That's new to me. The actual ages being spelled out.
Yeah. Yes, they are. The ages from Adam all the way through to Noah, and then from Noah's one son, he had three, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, but they take one, Shem, which means the name. And it is through Shem, as you see on this chart, Shem and Arphaxad and Seth and Eber and Peleg and all the way down to Abram. And Abram, Isaac, Jacob, all of their ages, their names, and the length of their life are spelled out for us. And so it shows you in this chart that even Noah was contemporary with Jared and with Enoch and Methuselah and Lamech, and even, of course, Shem was Noah's son. And but after the flood, it cut off everybody on the other side of the flood and starts a whole new genealogy. But the genealogy from Shem is followed simply because it leads to Christ. And the first portion of this chapter, it illustrates the departure from God's ways and the moral decline in society. So this process had its roots in the intermarriage of the sons of God, which were called the seed of the woman, and the daughters of men, seed of the serpent. And it's evident that in order to save humanity, God was going to have to terminate a condition which had no human remedy, and it was getting worse and worse, the moral decline, which is exactly the way Jesus described the world at a time when he returns. He said that even as it was in the days of Noah, they were buying and selling and giving in marriage and knew not until Noah entered the ark and the flood swept them all away. So in Genesis chapter 6, as we've left chapter 4 and 5, seeing the genealogies, chapter 6 opens up to a description of the condition of society. And verses 1 through 3 we read, "And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose." Now this presented a problem, because as we might explain, a lot of times people think that the sons of God were angels, or they were some form of higher being than humans. Well, that's not the case at all. The sons of God are actually the believers that came from Seth's line. Seth, remember, was appointed instead of Abel after Cain killed him. And those, we're told in the last verse of chapter 4, that then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. Now, of course we know they were calling upon the name of the Lord before that. As a matter of fact, they called upon the name of the Lord from the time Adam knew the Lord, but what that's translated into saying is they called themselves by the name of the Lord. In other words, to identify themselves with a community of believers, they called themselves by Yahweh's name. And so they bore his name as his sons, as even as a son's last name is that of his father. If he took on a different last name, that's his business, but he can only do it when he gets old enough to go to the courtroom, courthouse and say, I want to change my name. I don't like Isbel, I'm going to change it to Smith or whatever. But the name of the Lord was taken on by these sons of God as an identifying remark, just like Christadelphians were taken on by the believers in the days of Dr. John Thomas. Back in 1832, young John Thomas came over from England on a ship, and it was nearly shipwrecked, but he was saved along with everyone else. Well, he started studying the Bible, and it wasn't too long before he realized that there were no communities that actually taught what the Bible taught. They were teaching doctrines of their own. Well, this young John Thomas was a Hebrew and a Greek scholar, and a Latin scholar, and a French scholar, and an English scholar, and he knew that what he was hearing from the platform was far and away from the Scriptures.
Well, his name came up at work.
Oh, did it?
Someone asked me, okay, well, what exactly do the Christadelphians believe? And I couldn't exactly explain it. So I pointed her to the page. And she was like, well, it started from a man. So I looked up her Baptist.
Right.
And I'm like, well, Lisa, if you look at any religion out there,
John Bunyan started the Baptist.
From
1660. Right. Right. The responsibility falls upon other men and women to make sure that that man is quoting according to Scripture, which is not something they do with their pastors in their churches. They don't do that. Now, John Thomas insisted that men and women look at the Scriptures and test him and try to prove him wrong. And that way, he could come to be right if he was wrong. So it's very important how men teach other men and women. And he taught them to look for truth and to make sure you weren't accepting lies. So the identity of the sons of God and the identity of the seed of men, the daughters of men, was already established through Cain and his murder of Abel and the replacement of Abel by Seth, which Abel and Seth, by the way, are a type. They type because they point forward to the death of Jesus by his brethren and the resurrection of Jesus by God, because God gave Seth to Eve. Moving on. Adam and Eve, in this chart you'll notice, gave birth to Cain and Abel and Seth. As far as the record goes, we do know that from the record they had sons and daughters. Cain's descendants, in the red box on the left, were called the daughters of men. They governed their lives by the three principles that sin is always found to be channeled through in our behavior. Our mind, our moral lapses, and then our behavior and our character. Lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, and pride of life. On the other hand, you go all the way over to Seth on the right side. In the blue box, we see Seth's descendants were called the sons of God because they called themselves by the name of the Lord. And they walked by sight, they worshiped by their feelings, and they're self-willed celebrities. Now, this was actually a descent. This is not what they were supposed to be doing. But their religion had deteriorated into a religion of feelings, a religion of seeing, a religion of appearances, a religion of personalities, much like we have today. We see personalities on television and preachers prancing back and forth in front of a large crowd to gain their attention and their applause and their praise and their amens. And we see their pictures hugely plastered with their lovely wives all dressed to kill on the billboards of the highway.
Is the Osteen maybe?
No, I'm not calling any names, Deborah. I'm just saying, the personality cult of Jesus making Jesus himself a personality instead of studying what he did in certain cases to understand the principles by which he lived, which were the principles of God's righteousness, because that is the kind of faith we have to have. The faith, the belief that God's Word is right. Even when it feels like we're in the wrong, if we believe what God says and do it, He's going to have our back. Even when we're afraid, especially when we're afraid, to implement and put into action and to put into demonstration our faith, what we believe. When we're afraid to walk the talk, we need to apply it and do it, because God draws closer to us when we do that. It's when we say, well, I believe in God, but I think I better handle this one on my own without His help. I think I better fudge on this test. I better cheat on this. I better deny Jesus in this crowd. I better not stand up for the things of principle in God's Word. I better just say, praise the Lord, and go do what I want to do. See, that's
or be like where I was, where I wasn't sure who to believe, so just didn't do anything.
Right, right.
And I felt the need to learn, and that's why I ended up back here.
Sure. That's
I prayed and prayed about it, and this is where I ended up, so I feel like this is where God led me.
That's where God leads you. If you're sincere in your prayer, and I'm sure you were, and He knew you were, He's going to give you your answers. And that requires asking questions, doing the study, and listening to the Word in your heart and mind. But make sure the Word is going in. Don't just carry the Bible around like a lot of people do as a prop. You know, they carry it around, they bring it to church, they set it down, they sing from the hymnals, they pick up their book, and they go, and they never hear anything from the pulpit from the Bible. And see, that's the danger. That's the it's like a charade. It's almost like a disguise or a play or a theatrical play. We got the props, and we got the costume, and we got the script, and we know the buzzwords that we're supposed to utter between one another as believing Christians. But when it really gets down to where the rubber meets the road and there's real faith in action to be seen, we wimp out because we don't really believe, and the time comes when it requires us to. But looking back at the chart, there was an intermarriage, because the religion of Seth's descendants, those sons of God, if you look at those names in the genealogy of chapter 5 that we were looking at, like Adam and Seth and Enos and so on, you look at the names and the meanings of those names, and it's really amazing that they show a deterioration in the faith of the sons of God. And pretty soon there's even an exchange. There's some of the sons of Cain named the same way as the sons of sons of Seth. So pretty soon they're just about the same, and they start fraternizing and socializing with each other without a clear separation, a clear belief of a rigid fence, a line, a belief that separates the mind of the sons of the daughters of men from the sons of God. Pretty soon they're integrating, ignoring the conflicting ideas that the sons of God should have been laying out, saying, do you believe this the way we understand it? They should have been doing that, but they didn't. They preferred to look upon the daughters of men and see what the community of Cain had to offer to them. What did they bring to the table? It was a slow, gradual process that lasted over 1,500 years. But at the end of that 1,500 years, there was no difference in the sons of God and the daughters of men. There was no separating. And what does the word holy mean? You remember? Holy means separate. So there was no holiness there. They were not separate from each other. They were unified. They had unity. At last, we have unity. But was that unity really based upon the Word of God believed and obeyed? No, of course not. And that's, of course, what led to false religion, as you can see there at the intermarriage in the middle of the box in the middle that's red and blue together, that intermarriage resulted in false religion. So, what was the results of that? Well, Genesis 6:4-5, the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh. Yet his days shall be 120 years. He's only got 120 more years before I flood this world, is basically what God was saying. That's my parenthesis. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. So there was really no righteousness at all except for Noah. So God was going to annihilate. This was the first ELE. And an ELE is an acronym for extinction level event. And this was the first one. And God brought it upon the earth because there was moral decline and depravity and endangering the lives of Noah and his wife and sons and their wives. And if they're endangered because they're carrying the package, and the package is the egg in the women, the three women, especially Shem's wife. They're carrying the package that will bring about the ultimate Messiah, the seed of the woman. Remember that God promised in the curse on the serpent? Shem's wife, Shem ended up carrying the seed. She carried the egg, and the pair of them produced the lineage that would ultimately produce the lineage of Christ. Jesus refers to a similar condition in Matthew 24, verse 37, which would exist in the last days and can only be corrected by God's intervention. He says, Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. But of that day and hour knoweth no man. No, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered into the ark, and knew not until the flood came and took them all away, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. That would be in Matthew 24:34-39. The world is no different today. Humanism is taking over. As a matter of fact, I ate breakfast next to the Houston Chronicle paper and saw an article that said, Christianity in the U.S. is on the decline. Now, Christianity, as in error doctrinally as it has become over 2,000 years, and it's just a shadow of its former self, nonetheless was a preservative against moral and social decline and decay. The worse things get, the more difficult it's going to be for Christians to stand up against that kind of moral decay and decline. And so we're going to see definitely we're going to see that happen.
Well, and most of the youth nowadays, they don't even learn the Bible because they took prayer out of school. They can't even talk about religion in school. The parents don't go to church. Some of them just listen to the TV evangelist.
Sure.
I mean, I have the one at work, the one that wants to try, and I told her I don't not arguing, but she hasn't been to church in probably over a year, but she's still going to heaven, you know. She goes, as long as you believe, and
yeah, see, that's the lie. That's part of the lie that people have been lulled into. They can have their cake and eat it too, and believe that God is a doting grandfather who's going to turn a blind eye.
They have no idea about Jesus.
They don't. They don't. And that is the fault of the parents not teaching them properly. So Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord in Genesis 6 and 8. And this verse introduces us to Noah, a just man. And that just man was called perfect or mature, complete. Not perfect and sinless, but he was recognized by God as the kind of man that God would want to call his son. He was a righteous man. And it was around this small group that God would once again build the community that would preserve the seed of the woman. And the remainder of the 6th chapter of Genesis describes the building of the ark that would save them from the flood of destruction which came upon the earth. And this chapter contains a description of the construction of the ark and the gathering of the animals, birds, and creeping things. And it makes me wonder, with all the rain we've been having, if we might not want to start building one ourselves today. Genesis 7 and verse 23, and every living substance was destroyed which was upon the face of the ground, both man and cattle and the creeping things and the fowl of the heaven, and they were destroyed from the earth, and Noah only remained alive, and they that were with him in the ark. So this chapter really gives us the essential facts of the flood and the destruction that came upon all flesh, with that exception of Noah and his family. And it was indeed God's hand.
So in 24 it says the waters flooded the earth for 150 days.
Right.
So that thing, where'd the 40 days and 40 nights come from?
It rained that long, but the waters were up on the earth for that long, for 150 days. Actually, I believe it was a year and 10 days that the water was actually on the face of the earth. If you do the addition and follow the record in the scriptures, it tells you that Noah and his family were in the ark 110 days total. I'm sorry, a year and 10 days, not 110, a year and 10 days. So that would be 375 days, basically. Yeah, that was a long time. Yeah, with all those animals. Yeah, that's true. So Genesis 8, verse 3 through 5, and the waters returned from off the earth continually, and after the end of the 150 days, the waters were abated. And the ark rested in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, upon the mountains of Ararat, and the waters decreased continually until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the 1st day of the month, were the tops of the mountains seen. So see, you've already got 10 months now. And so there was another 2 months and 10 days before they could come out of the ark. So the flood gradually dries up. The ark comes to rest on the mountains of Ararat, and which is actually in northeastern Turkey. Noah and his family are able to stand once again on dry ground. And in gratitude, Noah builds an altar. He offers a sacrifice unto the Lord, and God gives him the reassurance that he would never again curse the ground for man's sake. So he says, while the earth remaineth, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, day and night, shall not cease. So God was not going to destroy the earth again. We read in Genesis 8 that God remembered Noah and every living thing and all the cattle that was with him in the ark. God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters assuaged, the fountains also of the deep, and the windows of heaven were stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained. He said in verse 13, I do set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a token of a covenant between me and the earth. And it shall come to pass, when I bring a cloud over the earth, that the bow shall be seen in the cloud. And I will remember my covenant, which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the waters shall no more to become a flood to destroy all flesh. And the bow shall be in the cloud, and I will look upon it, that I may remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is upon the earth. So that bow consists of clouds and light. And later the rainbow in Revelation is used as a symbol of that covenant that God made with the whole earth, and that he wouldn't destroy the earth. And that rainbow is seen by John, who wrote the book of Revelation, circling a throne. And there was one that sat upon the throne. This is in Revelation chapter 10. And it's an absolutely beautiful symbolic chapter. And in order to understand the symbols, one has to let the Bible speak to interpret those symbols. And part of that speech about the rainbow, of course, is going to come from Genesis, what we just read. That bow was put in the sky by God himself, and it consists of the elements necessary to see that bow, of course, are clouds and light and the evaporation process. So here you see a map of where Mount Ararat is in Turkey. Here's a satellite photo of Mount Ararat, and you can see it snow-covered. Little Ararat on the left. They're inactive volcanoes located in eastern Turkey. Mount Ararat rises over 3 miles above sea level, which of course, if the ark, we're told, rested upon Mount Ararat, that means that a 3-mile flood of waters had to ascend above, up to the level of Mount Ararat. It really flooded the earth, took everything out. It wasn't a local flood. Genesis 9, God blessed Noah and his sons and said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth, and I will establish my covenant with you. Neither shall all flesh be cut off any more by the waters of a flood, and neither shall there be any more a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, This is the token of the covenant which I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for perpetual generations. So there's a hope in the Bible that God is never going to destroy the earth by water or flood or fire. He's going to regenerate it and turn it into a globe covered with men and women. And he's planning to do that. And he's in the process of doing that invisibly. He's not making it known to everybody, but he's certainly doing it. It's in the process of happening even as we speak. In the 11th verse, God expands this promise by establishing a covenant with Noah, which would have the rainbow as its token. So it was an everlasting covenant between the Creator and every living creature. It was God's assurance that there would never again be a flood that would destroy all mankind. And again, Genesis 10 starts off and shows us it's a chapter regarding the Tower of Babel. It'd be good for you to read that. Now these are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and unto them were sons born after the flood. So you can see that the Tower of Babel and that little dotted dashed line, vertical that goes down to the green dot, actually depicts where in the timeline that the Tower of Babel was, and that before that the whole earth was of one language until God changed all their languages. So this chapter shows the development of the generations of the sons of Noah, and once again the earth was repopulated according to God's commandment to be fruitful and multiply. Genesis 11 is the Tower of Babel. The whole earth was of one language and one speech, and it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said one to another, Go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime, or tar, had they for mortar. So they refused to do what God told them to do. And instead, they joined together with one language, one speech, and they built this tower thinking that they could escape any further flooding of the earth if God decided to change his mind. They said,
you know what amazes me with that, with the Tower of Babel?
What's that?
I've actually had someone tell me if I read further in the Bible, I'll find out that that's when he gave them all, they say he made them all have different languages so they could go out and start all these different nationalities. And I'm like, that's not my understanding. My understanding was he confused their languages where they couldn't understand each other and build this bad tower.
That's right. That's exactly what he did.
So, I mean, I don't know.
As a matter of fact, you can actually show them the end result will be when Christ returns, the prophecies tell us that he will change all of these languages to one. And that will help create unity in the world instead of superstition, fear, paranoia, and antagonism between different races and languages. We're told that there will be one language and they will all serve the Lord with one consent. So, and you can see an earnest of that, sort of a type, in the day of Pentecost, when the disciples spoke the gospel, and all those who were of different dialects and languages could understand what they were saying. So it was creating a unity by a miraculous means. The result of the Tower of Babel was the beginning of the kingdom of Babylon. The word Babel means confusion. and you can see on the map that it was there located close to where Iran is in Iraq. The possible location of Babel, possible location of Ur at the bottom of that map shows you that down close to the Persian Gulf, Ur is the city where Abram came from. And that's what it will introduce us to ultimately the life of Abram. So this chapter gives us a description of the form of society that developed after the flood. A great congregation of people migrated from the east to a plain in the land of Shinar, present-day Iraq. The memory of the flood seemed to have had a strong influence on the events that took place as related in this chapter. The impulse to build a city and a tower evidently sprang from a desire for safety and from pride in their social system. And pride is one thing that God cannot tolerate. Safety lies not in cities and towers, companies, corporations, armies, governments, but it lies in obedience to God's law. So ultimately, you can see from the map, Noah's Ark has been found. There are many teams that have actually seen it. They've gone up, they've taken pictures of it from up in the air, from down the ground and under the glaciers. The Tower of Babel is shown here to be the possible place where it was built. Sodom and Gomorrah further down. The real Mount Sinai, of course, there's about 50 different ideas about where Sinai is located. But as you research in some of these findings, it's very interesting. You learn quite a bit. So we notice how God frustrated their rebellious intent by confounding their language, scattering them abroad upon the face of all the earth. And it's significant that the name of their city is called Babel. And the margin in the Bible is alternative is confusion. The remaining verses in this chapter give us the generation of Shem, one of Noah's sons. In verse 26, we see the first mention of the name Abram. So we'll end this lesson with the introduction of that man who is to be the father of the race, later to be called God's chosen people. Interesting that today in Germany, we have in Strasbourg, Germany, the parliament of the EU, the European Union, was built after a picture that was painted by an artist of the Tower of Babel.
Oh, wow.
So the unity, the European Union, that kind of unity is exactly what was defying God back in the days of the Tower of Babel. Isn't that interesting? So next week, Lord willing, we'll pick up with Abraham in lesson 5, and we'll go from Abraham to Moses and show you the highlights. And that's all we're having time for. And presently, that's all you need for baptism, is to understand the highlights of God's plan and the history. So, okay, very good. Well, we'll conclude then.